Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 18 of GT Masters, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of GT class race cars. And within the GT class, or GT type competition vehicles, there's a broad range of vehicles. You've got big full-on sports cars, supercar based race cars in some cases, and sometimes more production based vehicles such as some of the muscle race cars like the Challenger and the Camaro. On this occasion, this is more one of those vehicles. This is the Lotus Elise Race Car, and there are actually two Lotus Elise race cars featured on the game. There's one which is based on the earlier model Elise, which is this one, and there is of course the later model 111R Elise race car. But for this particular episode we are featuring the older model of the Elise, and straight off the bat, the main issue I think that this car has, and pretty much any race car like it, like the Spoon Honda Fit, both of the Elise race cars, the Suzuki Cappuccino race car, and even to some degree the two muscle based race cars, is that they're just a little bit too niched for their own good. They're not bad cars by any means, but they don't have very many natural rivals. There's just not enough competition for these cars on the game. They're just not fast enough to take on the big dogs of the GT class, such as the GTRs, the R8s, etc. But at the same time, they're race cars, so very few lobby hosts will allow you to take on road cars with them. But that being said, if you can work around that issue and find a place where you need or want to use one of these cars, which one should you go for? Well, as we already said, we're considering the earlier model Elise for today. Now this is a pretty expensive car for what you get. It's 137 grand, which is actually more than the newer model Elise. And both cars have their own advantages and disadvantages. I would say of the two, this is probably the better Lotus Elise based race car. It's lighter, it has more torque, a much higher PP, but also a higher price, and it's not quite as powerful. So there are some trade-offs between the two, but overall I personally prefer this car. I think it looks more convincing as a race car, and I would also say that regardless of personal opinion, it is overall probably the stronger of the two. That being said, what do you get for 137 grand? Because that's 37 grand more than the Motorsport Elise, which can usually, according to most hosts, it would depend on the person of course, but can usually be used in street car lobbies. And that's 100 grand. We reviewed it recently. It's got a pretty decent spec, so why buy this version over the Motorsport Elise? Well, you get a 1.8 litre engine, 585 pp fully tuned, which is perhaps a little bit too high for its own good, but still impressively high. It sits at 319 horsepower, which is okay, not quite as much as the newer model, and not quite as much as the Motorsport Elise either. It puts out 237 foot-pounds of torque, which is more than the newer model Elise, weighs 645 kilos, which again is significantly lighter than the newer model Elise, and puts out just under 500 horsepower per tonne. So it's got a decent spec. It's not amazing, but it's certainly not bad. It's almost like a really high-end go-kart. Is it any good though, in practice? Well, I think a lot of people have bought this car on GT6. I know I've owned and sold it a couple of times on different memories that I've played through the game on, and it's, as I said, a little bit too niched for its own good. It's a bit like the Suzuki Cappuccino. That's actually the perfect comparison, I think. The Cappuccino race car is an awesome little race car. It looks fantastic, it's incredibly fun to drive, and it takes corners like nobody's business, but there's just nothing for it to go up against. It's too niched. This car does have some rivals, such as the other Lotus Elise, and to some degree stuff like the Challenger and Camaro race cars, perhaps some of the other lower end race cars like the Spoon S2000, etc. But in general, there just isn't enough for it to go up against to make it legitimately a great race car. Is it a bad car? No, certainly not. Is it worth spending the money on? Well, I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't say no to any car, to be honest. There are some cars which I would recommend probably not buying, but I wouldn't necessarily say that nobody should ever try this car, because it's certainly not bad. The problem is it's just not good enough, while at the same time being a little bit too good in most people's eyes to take on road cars. Whereas in actual fact, this car would be more at home with taking on road cars than it would other race cars, because although technically speaking it is a race car, it's actually not as quick as the road-going Lotus Elise if you tune it. So the payoff is a little bit underwhelming overall. Should you buy it? Well, depends on the kind of driver you are, depends on what kind of cars you like to drive or collect. If you're the kind of person who just likes to have cars that are fun to drive or quick around corners and you don't care much about straight line performance, then it's a good car, because it's not all that quick in a straight line, but the cornering is fantastic. If though you're looking to spend 100+ grand on something that can actually win races consistently on multiple tracks against varying levels of opposition, this car doesn't really do that. For one make racing, which I know some people do, especially with the newer model Elise Race Car, it's a great car. You can really have some fun in one make races with this. But of course, in order to do that, you need to be able to guarantee that everyone else also owns the car. So, as I said, it's not a bad car, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend spending that cash if you're purely looking for a winning car. But that's it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.